technical difficulties.
Where'd the music go? Oh.
All right, can everybody see okay? Looks good so far? Okay. And so like I was saying, we provide legal and medical accompaniment and advocacy. We also have support groups available. And so we have an adult survivor support group, and that is the first Monday of every month. As well as counselors are there to provide support, and that's open for all genders. And we are soon to be rolling out a teen support group. And so all that information will be available on the YWCA Facebook page with information. And then lastly is we provide prevention education programming. And so I always like to say, like, the goal is to be working ourselves out of jobs. That way, you know, sexual assault and sexual violence isn't a thing that happens. And so a way that that can be done is educating the community more than just awareness, but prevention. So focusing on the behaviors and skills that lead to sexual violence, and such as educating young kids on personal safety, boundaries, bystander intervention. And then we also have different groups like Girl Power, which is an empowerment group for female identifying students. Bigs and Littles is a mentoring program, and then Safe Dates, which is educational programming on healthy relationships, and that's for high school students and middle school students. And so let's get started talking a little bit about trauma holistically. So sexual assault is one specific aspect of that. And so we're going to be focusing more so now broadly on what is trauma. So trauma is the response to a distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual. And so this often is associated with feelings of helplessness, diminished sense of self, inability to feel the full range of feelings. And so it's important to note that trauma is not the event itself, rather than the response to it. And so a way that this could be further understood is, for example, two kids, maybe our siblings are in the same home. And so maybe there's domestic violence happening within that home. And so two kids may respond completely different. And so that may look like one kid regressing in their skills, such as bedwetting or sucking their thumbs, in which that's not a developmentally or age appropriate. And so more so regressing that way, whereas another child may be, you know, acting out at school, or there may be truancy issues. And so it's important to know that it's a response to that event. And also protective factors play a huge role in how that that child may be responding. And so that's also something really important to know, is that how much it is impacted by also, you know, those protective factors of what's present within that child's life. All right, so there are different kinds of trauma. So acute, that is more so that one-time event that's happening, that initial exposure. And so an example of that could be a car accident, a one-time car accident. It could also be a natural disaster, like a flood or a hurricane, something that's also a one-time event. It could be a single event of assault or abuse, or a sudden loss or witnessing violence. And so that more so acute is that one-time event. Repetitive, that is exposure to multiple different forms of trauma and prolonged events. And so, for example, this could look like receiving medical care or having a diagnosis that of an illness. It could also be school violence, such as bullying, so repetitive, more so ongoing. This also includes racial or gender discrimination. Complex trauma. So this complex is very similar to repetitive, but it looks different because this is more so family units that we're talking about. And so once again, it's multiple chronic ongoing traumatic events. But this is where it's more so the interpersonal relationships that an individual is exposed to, such as family violence. And what we know is actually 3 to 10 million children in the United States are exposed or witness domestic violence in the home. Developmental. So this is the early onset exposure to repetitive trauma. And so this is more so as an infant or a child, like a young child being exposed to trauma. And that includes things such as neglect or abandonment or physical assault or abuse. And vicarious trauma, this is when an individual is experiencing trauma through someone that they're living with. This can be seen as individuals who are there's somebody who's abusive within the home, but they personally aren't experiencing abuse from that person. So this is where like witnessing domestic violence in the home, that vicarious trauma. It could also be vicarious if a young child is exposed or friends with somebody else who is experiencing abuse, or a family member having mental illness. Historical trauma. So this is something that many folks of color experience, and that includes historical trauma such as genocide, colonialism such as residential schools, slavery and war. So we know the immigrant population, asylum seeking, refugees, all experience historical trauma. And then lastly is intergenerational trauma. And so this is trauma who really passed down through generations of individuals who then are maybe struggling to get access to the resources that they need, and then as a result are their trauma is then affecting the children that they are then raising and bringing into the world. And so this is more so at the coping skills and patterns that are existing within that family unit. And so the source here is from yourexperiencesmatter.com. And so just to have an idea of how prevalent this issue is we know that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will experience sexual abuse before the age of 18. Sexual abuse is a massive trauma that's affecting our young people. And so also 1 in 4 children will be beaten by a parent. 1 in 3 couples engage in physical violence. 1 in 4 Americans grow up with an alcoholic relative. 1 in 8 children witness their mother being beaten or hit. And so this is a massive issue that's affecting children. And we're going to be talking more so what that looks like developmentally, as well as biologically, how that affects the body and the brain for children that then become adults, and what are the health effects as a result of that. All right, so what we know is that trauma in the brain affects trauma in the body. And so I like to think about it this way. Even so, I know a lot of my coworkers will be like right before the holidays or right around things get really busy. The second you have a break or you have that chance to decompress, you're more likely to get sick. And so what happens is that when not only just trauma, but just stress in general affects your immune system. And so what this looks like is when those stressors come into the body, it activates your your stress response. And so this is a biological response. It's something that's adaptive that we have no control over. It's something that deeply benefits us, in which, for example, we see You know, we're on a hike and we see a bear. It's always been biologically beneficial for us to respond to these environmental stressors and to activate that response. You know, that way humans know that it's important that they need to get out of that situation, or how to react in a way that keeps us going, that protects us. But what the difference is that biologically some of these things are helpful for us, whereas, you know, some of the ways in which the body responds now is not always helpful. You know, for example, like, you know, how pervasive overworking is in our society that values you know, to keep going and to produce, you know, capitalism, how much that affects our response. And so this also looks like affecting your heart and cardiovascular system. And so when you're stressed out, you're pumping blood, your heart's racing really fast. You know, that puts a strain on that cardiovascular system. It also puts a strain on the gut and metabolic system. So we turn our food into energy, but also when we're stressed, that may lead to gut issues. And so biologically, what that helps to do is when we are under threat or are under attack, when we, you know, essentially what would happen is when you release your bowels, it helps you to then be able to run faster. And so it's a really cool thing that our bodies are able to protect us like that, but it's not always helpful, right? And the fact of like upset stomach or having digestive issues may be a response to stress. How I was talking about before, our immune system, how much that affects our ability to fight against infection. And especially now, I was just talking to somebody about, like, you know, when we're stressed out, it affects our immune system. So we're more likely to get sick. But now that, you know, COVID's a thing, how much that affects our ability to then get sick as well. And so it's this cycle of these stressors and then responding. And then also our neuroendocrine system and maintaining that hormonal balance. And so I really like this chart and this graph here showing the fight, flight, freeze response. So just a couple important things to note. So we have our sympathetic system, and that is our fight or flight response. And so some of the things that you'll notice when you're feeling stressed out or maybe are in danger. And, you know, when we're talking about danger, you know, some of the ways that I explain this to kids is it could be you have to talk in front of class. Maybe you feel overwhelmed because you have to work with somebody who's been picking on you for class. Maybe you have to give a speech. And so what happens, like I was saying, is, you know, your eyes dilate, your blood pressure goes up, your adrenaline's running. And so flight is, you know, you're wanting to get out of that situation. You're moving away from the stressor. So some of the things you may be experiencing are panic, fear, anxiety, worry, or concern. Fight, you're moving towards that thing. So feelings of rage, anger, frustration. And so this is more so what we feel like we can deal with. Whereas the parasympathetic here, that's when our body is so overwhelmed with those stressors that it can no longer deal and process. It's in that emergency state. And so this is a majority of where sexual assault victim survivors, at least from my experience, like most individuals who experience trauma are within this freeze state. And so we notice a lot of victim survivors feeling shame that they weren't able to do more, or to be able to respond, or to say no. But what we really know is that it's a body's response in order to keep you safe, and in which the fear or the danger is so incredibly overwhelming that the body shuts down. And so this looks like feelings of helplessness, disassociation. So feeling like you're out of your body, like you need to disconnect from yourself in order to not feel or be present in the overwhelming sensations that are happening within your body. It could also look like being completely out of energy, so just exhausted and shutting down. And so what we really want to be at is in the parasympathetic stage, but also within the rest and digest. And so a way to connect and to fight against these responses is to connect within those systems that help to regulate back that nervous system. And so what can be incredibly helpful and useful is breathing techniques. And so what breathing techniques does is it helps to regulate your body back into that rest or digest system. And so grounding tools can also be a huge one in being present and safe within the body. And so triggers are often something that happens as a response to something traumatic that include the senses that bring that individual back to the trauma they experienced. And being present and grounding tools helps to help that individual feel safe within that present moment. And so grounding tools can be something going back to your sensations. What's something that you see, touch, smell, that you feel, that you can taste, that helps to make you feel safe and present within that moment. And so these are just some tools to be able to regulate back into that parasympathetic, that rest and digest system, because that's what really fights against some of those negative health outcomes of the trauma response. And then I will just want to keep an eye on the chat. So thanks, Cheryl, for sharing the ACE study. All right, so a little bit more about childhood adverse experiences. So trauma events that can be negative have long-lasting effects on health and well-being. And so I'm going to go ahead and kind of break down this chart, but what we see in the left-hand column is originally different forms of trauma. So abuse, neglect, childhood challenges. And so this study was a groundbreaking study. And to learn more about this, I highly recommend looking into Nadine Burke's TED Talk on the ACE study, and she goes into that more. But what the study originally did, it was a long-term study that I forget the amount of people that it had looked at. It was 17,000 participants surveyed over 2 years, and then the follow-up was another 15 years. And what they measured was essentially did an inventory of what kinds of forms of trauma did individuals experience. And so some of the measures that they had looked at were the abuse, household challenges, and then the neglect. Something important to note that the study did not originally look at was the adverse childhood experiences of racial violence and the ways in which Black, Indigenous, people of color, including Latinx community as well as other marginalized communities face as a result of their identities. And so something that was not considered when that study was originally done was really looking at the different ways that oppression plays a role in these adverse childhood experiences and the outcomes on that. And so now we know more, and we also are able to connect the dots now as well. But originally, something the study did not look at was racial violence as well. And so what we see here is that 1/8 of the population have more than 4 ACEs. And so when somebody experiences more than 4 ACEs, they're 3 times more likely to have levels of lung disease and adult smoking. They're 14 times more likely to have suicide attempts, 4.5 times more likely to develop depression, 11 times more likely to experience drug use and abuse, 4 times more likely to engage in sexual activity before the age of 15, and 2 times more likely to experience liver disease. And as you can see, and also the bottom left-hand corner, people with 6+ ACEs can die 20 years earlier than those who have none. And so this is really just was a groundbreaking study. It really was absolutely eye-opening in the field of, especially for nonprofits that work in addressing these different adverse childhood experiences, and really is important for everybody to know how much trauma and being trauma informed is vital in making sure our population is, able to live healthy, successful lives. Because as you can see here, looking at this chart, is that it affects neural development, social, emotional, cognitive impairment, adoption of high health risk behaviors, such as the ones that we saw before of smoking and liver disease, disability, and social problems leading to early death. And so this is something that just was absolutely staggering results when it first was released. Now we know more information to be able to connect the dot as well with marginalized communities. And so really almost 70% of the population has at least one ACE. And so when we're talking about trauma-informed care, this is more so something that's a buzzword, but really it's so important in being able to prevent trauma from happening, but also being able to properly address it on all community levels, from both individuals who are working with children, but also those who are working in, drug rehabilitation centers that are working with those who experience trauma, with and all those different community levels. So when we're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, focusing on the very bottom, the physiological needs. So you'll notice at the bottom is thicker, and then it gets smaller as you go to the top as the triangle shape. And so one cannot access the top of the triangle without first meeting those basic needs. And some of those basic needs are access to food, water, obviously breathing, shelter, clothing, and sleep. So those are all things that we need to survive before meeting any of our other needs. And then as the chart goes up, we're focusing on health, employment, property, family, social stability, then to love and belonging, that sense of community. Then self-esteem, how are we then achieving, feeling good about ourselves and feeling like confident within the abilities that we are offering. And then self-actualization, this is a sense of purpose. And so we're not able to have a sense of purpose and meaning without, or really to be able to focus on those things without meeting those basic human needs and necessities. And so the really awesome thing about the YWCA Lancaster, and within the YWCA in general, is that we're meeting the needs of the individuals and community members. And so, for example, like when we're focusing on housing, our residents and housing department is focusing on meeting the needs of those who are low income, or maybe who have potentially disabilities, who need access to safe and secure housing. We're also looking at employment and how important our child care department is in making sure that working families have a safe and secure place to and access to child care that meets their needs. And so, access to that child care is so important in being able to have stable and secure jobs. when we're also looking at family and social stability, something that SAPSI does is really addressing sexual assault on that family and community level. And so we know that sexual assault doesn't just affect that individual, it also affects the whole family unit. And so we're focusing on the needs of sexual assault victim survivors and their loved ones, and feeling that sense of confidence within themselves, focusing on safety and security within the different systems, legal or medical, and focusing on those health outcomes as well, and preventing abuse from happening. And then as well as our racial and gender equity center, and focusing on, how can we also educate the community on the different ways that oppression plays a role in being able to have access to those basic needs, and the ways in which Black and Brown, specifically Black and Brown communities, then are denied access. And so something that's really important to keep in mind is this hierarchy of needs, and how important our center, is in being able to address these needs, and the ways in which trauma affects ability to have access, or the ability to then be able to have those health outcomes as well. And so this is more so if folks in the chat want to participate or, call it out. But as an adult, what are some feelings that have come up for you within the COVID-19 crisis? So what are some things that
I want to say a lot of anxiety, just because of the unknown.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I see in the chat, lethargic, not wanting to do anything. Yep. Kind of going back to that graph of the freeze response, of how when we reach that level of our body is so activated, how it shuts down, and how then we have no energy, we've depleted it. I definitely have noticed that for myself too. Some of the other things that I've kind of have felt as a human is the feelings of loneliness, of not having that in-person interaction is so important, kind of, and going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that feeling of longing and belonging, and how so many of us are missing that right now, or how different it looks. I also see in the chat not wanting to do things that I usually like to do, like binge TV, how to find new self-care routines. Yeah, absolutely. Some of the other feelings that have come up is feelings of, depression, worry, anxiety is a massive one with the COVID-19 outbreak. Feeling exhausted or lonely, anger and frustration with the current administration and how they've been not handling it, and feeling frustrated that maybe other people aren't taking this as seriously as maybe we feel like we are. And so that can also be a huge one, of feelings of anger at the injustices that are happening right now. We also know that COVID-19 is drastically impacting Black and Brown communities, communities of color, and how oftentimes that's not being acknowledged or recognized. And so we know that this COVID-19 current pandemic is absolutely a form of trauma. This is an unusual, unexpected event. Seeing all the media and always having access to that floods that nervous system of the flight or flight of your stress response, of always having access to information right now, which, you know, sometimes is helpful for a sense of control, but sometimes is also not helpful. Also, you know, family members or people may be sick or maybe have died, you know, and explaining that to children of who maybe didn't know about pandemics or didn't know about how intense or scary this all can be. Also, we, like how I was saying before, of how important protective factors are in addressing trauma. And so some protective factors are, you know, access to those support systems, whether that's, you know, a community group, a religious group, a sports group, a social network or peers, you know, schools, and how different that looks within Zoom and chat and being able to connect with peers. And how right now too, there's ongoing changes. Truly every single day we're learning something new and something is changing. And so not only is it unexpected, but it's constantly ongoing and constantly changing. And especially for children now, adults are struggling to regulate their own emotions. And we know that that's incredibly important for children, and being able to regulate their own feelings is being able to have someone mirror that for them. And so right now, adults, many adults, we have never experienced this before. And so children are looking to us to be able to understand and know how to best deal with all the challenging feelings that are coming up. And oftentimes we're falling short, and to no fault of our own, like, this is really hard. And so even how that plays a role. And we know that one of the biggest protective factors for children who've experienced trauma is just having access to one stable and supportive adult. And so even the adults right now in children's life are struggling regulating themselves. And, you know, and that's okay. You know, we're, like I was saying, things are hard, but also taking in mind how much that also affects the young people that we work with, that we live with. And so just some also ways to respond, specifically with COVID-19 and what you may be noticing within children of these specific age groups. And so I got all this information from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And so some reactions that preschool children may be experiencing right now: fear of being alone or bad dreams, speech difficulties, loss of bladder, bowel control, constipation, bedwetting, kind of like how I was talking before with regression, change of appetite, or increased temper tantrums. And so ways to address this. Also, these are lovely tools just in general, as well as for responding to trauma and being trauma informed. But just being patient and tolerant, providing reassurance, whether that's verbal or physical, of acknowledging, like, yeah, like, things are really tough right now. It's okay to feel how you're feeling. Encouraging expression through play, reenactment, or storytelling. I will be sharing some resources at the very end to talk about how we work with children within our center of processing their trauma, which can be helpful for really all children in expressing their feelings. Planning calming or comforting activities, maintaining regular family routines, and really allowing something that's really a cornerstone of trauma-informed care is providing choice. And so, you know, asking children, would you like us to play with toys before bed, or would you like us to read before bed? And so allowing children to feel a sense of control when so much seems outside of their control. For school-age children, I'll just go through this really quick, but what some of the things you may be noticing are irritability, whining, clinging, nightmares, sleep or appetite disturbances, some of those physical symptoms that may be happening. You know, how we showed like trauma in the brain is like trauma in the body, and how those two are so deeply connected. And so there may be headaches more, there may be stomach aches, there are also, you know, feelings of anxiety, maybe their chest really hurts, withdrawal from peers, loss of interest. And so going back to that vagus nerve, so that the vagus nerve in trauma helps to, it's associated with social connection, and helps to, like how I was saying before, the parasympathetic of the rest and digest. And so social connection, as well as regulation of the body through mindfulness tools, can help with some of those symptoms of trauma. And so also setting limits, but play and regular exercise and stretching. So taking breaks between Zoom sessions, or, you know, letting them have fidget toys around them for school, or being able to set time that we're going to go outside, or, you know, we're going to play a YouTube video and get up and moving. And then for some of our older kiddos, really looking also similar things, but also some of the concerns about stigma and injustices that are happening right now. Also, similar things that adults are facing of agitation or decrease in energy. And so thinking about like also what is helping you right now of, you know, encouraging continuation of routines, keeping that those social spheres of, you know, who in their life can they go to talk to, limiting media exposure when it's no longer helpful, of, you know, the difference between being informed and then also flooding that nervous system to the point where you feel like you can no longer function, or are then not present within your life. And then taking time to address the stigma and prejudices, and really talking about, you know, how this outbreak is affecting different communities. And something that, you know, within this topic, and as we're talking, not only has a pandemic happened, but we're also seeing community violence against Black and brown bodies, and how much that has also affected trauma responses for young children of color, and seeing individuals who look like them being seeing the acts of violence against them, and how much protests, and how much these violence, and also how different even the ways in which media wise are talking about individuals who are speaking up against injustices, you know, that also plays a role within the trauma response, and how, you know, individuals and children of color are interpreting the world as safe or unsafe. And so also something to keep in mind, not only within COVID-19 and how children may be responding, but also children of color, and witnessing and seeing the ways in which injustices are playing a role and directly affect them. So that's also something to mention, not only within COVID-19, but the relationship between, you know, the community level violence and access to those services. And so just some supportive statements and questions to consider when talking to children. I will be here to help you through this. A huge way to help children is visualization. So, you know, using coloring, using body awareness, how we were talking about the brain and body connection. So drawing, like, how are you feeling today? If you could put into your feelings into a picture, what would it look like? If your feeling was a shape, what shape would it be? If your heart could listen, what would it say? You know, reminding children that you believe them, that they didn't do anything wrong. Talking about what can we do as adults to help support them in feeling safe. Talking about coping skills. What are things that help you feel safe when you're feeling overwhelmed? You know, what do you need from me when you're feeling overwhelmed? How can I support you in this feeling? And so here are some online resources to respond to trauma. So something that I always recommend for families who want to know more about teaching consent or those prevention skills is Safe Secure Kids. They have a whole bunch of online games, as well as worksheets and resources on addressing issues such as boundaries. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has something called Trinka and Sam series, and they're videos as well as worksheets that explain things like viruses as well as the pandemic in a way that's child friendly and age appropriate. And then Sesame Street has also been doing a really great job of addressing childhood trauma experiences. They've also have done some education awareness on talking to children about racial violence and racism. And they also have some as well, like worksheets that you can print out too. There's a lot of different books here, but the important thing to know is that there's so many resources right now, whether that's through play, through reading, through art, through you know, the internet, of being able to address some of the feelings that may be coming up as a response of, you know, what's happening in the world right now, but also just in general trauma. And so some of the ones that we have in our office is there is a series called Train Your Dragon. And so there's ones on Yoga Dragon, Angry Dragon. There's also so many books out there related to boundaries and consent. There's a lot of different ones on anxiety. And so Wilma Jean, the Worry Machine, is one in addressing feelings of anxiety that may be coming up for children. So here are just some of the ones that we put together that may be helpful. And also knowing like what is the kiddo interested in? What is something that they get the most out of or that they regularly request, whether that is play or if they really like books. You can kind of then choose which one the child may be more interested in. So some ways to address through play is Jenga is a really great one. You can actually write on the blocks different feeling words such as anger or happy or joy, feeling scared. And then you can play Jenga, and then once you take out the piece, talk about that feeling. And then here are just a couple of other games that address the connection between feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And Mad Dragon is also a really great one in addressing anger control. And so there's really fun interactive ways to get children talking about their feelings in a way that is most appropriate for where they are developmentally. And then some books for adults. You know, there's also really great it's cognitive behavioral therapy art activity books. The Body Keeps the Score is a really great one in addressing how the mind, body, and brain are all connected. And so that's something that we often refer back to when talking about trauma. As I was talking about Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, she also has a book out called Healing the Long-Term Effects of Childhood Adversity. Highly recommend that TED Talk for really understanding the holistic issue. And also if you're more so a visual person, also a really great tool. And then also another book here about the American foster care system and how that is a form of trauma as well. And so I included some of my contact information and so my emails here, as well as the best number to reach me at. So I did want to open up to see if there was a little bit of any questions. I see Cheryl asked a question about SAFC services and trauma. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So sexual assault is a form of trauma. And so right now we offer no cost counseling services to individuals who've experienced sexual assault, whether, despite no matter how much time has passed since the assault. And so oftentimes we have many adults who've experienced childhood sexual abuse who as adults are then ready to process their trauma. And so we are also soon to be rolling out therapy. And so I'm a counselor, but we have trained individuals who will be providing therapeutic services. And so we have a screening tool that an individual would call in who wants services. They would then complete the screening tool, and it would best decide what counselor they would best fit with. And so it's a way that individuals can also have therapeutic services, but the counseling services are more so looking at those short-term outcomes, such as working through the legal advocacy services, more so immediately processing different things that come up during maybe a crisis, as well as talking about more so those short-term goals, such as things related to intimacy, or questions about reporting, different areas such as that, whereas therapeutic services are more so that deep dive into trauma. Feel free to let me know if there's any other questions folks may have.
Baby Jane died, and we buried her for you. Some skeptical parents go to the authorities, but soon find out the system is on George's side. There were judges who ruled against parents who wanted to get the children back. There were policemen who ignored mothers and daughters who rushed to the police station to say that their child had been kidnapped. To the rich,
yeah, I also have a question on self-care and trauma. And so that's a really great question. And sorry, I'm losing my voice. So oftentimes there's different tools that can be used for trauma. So some of the different ways, some may work best for one person. And so what I had talked about at the beginning is SAPC is an empowerment based, meaning that we support an individual in doing what's best for them. We'll never tell somebody to what we think is best, but some different tools could be grounding tools, calming skills, processing, and then as well as more physical. And so there's a couple of different ways that an individual could most benefit from self-care. And some of those calming skills would be, like taking a bath. It could be going for a walk. It could be having a stress ball. It could be painting. Processing skills, this is more so being able to communicate about your trauma. So that could be through journaling. That could be through talking to a friend. It could be through counseling or therapy. More so the physical processing, this could be working out, going for a bike ride. It could be doing some type of self-defense class, or maybe a what's it called, boxing. And then lastly, the distraction tools. This is more so to this is the tools that could be used are watching TV. I'm a really big fan lately of Animal Crossing. It could be scrolling on your phone, and so different tools could be used for different times based off of what you need in that moment. And so not everything works best for everyone, and that's okay, but kind of coming up beforehand of, okay, when I am feeling this way, what can I do? And also different feelings, you need to respond in different ways. And so something that Dr. Mark Brackett, also a really great researcher from Yale Institute of the Child Center from Yale, talks about is something called the mood meter. And so based off of how you're feeling, your activation level, so are you, is it low activation or high activation? Based off of how your body is responding, and then pleasantness. So is it a very pleasant experience, like, or feeling, or is it not as pleasant? And so, for example, feeling joyful, that is a high activation. So you have more energy, and then it's also a pleasant experience or a pleasant emotion. And so you're going to do something different for when you're feeling joyful than what you would when you have a low activation, not as pleasant feelings, such as feeling depressed. And so you might need to do different things with those different feelings depending on what kind of energy you have too.
She just knew he was on something.
It was detachment.
All right, but that was a really great question. And so if you have any other questions as far as what our department does within the Sexual Assault Prevention and Counseling Center, you can look at our website and contact us that way, or you can always contact me with the information there to answer any more questions about trauma response, or sexual assault and trauma. I'd be happy to answer and support you all in any way. But thanks again for participating in this conversation and for letting me talk to you about the ACE study. And like I was saying, there's so much information. This is just kind of dipping your toes in the water about these topics. And then really also taking a look at as to how can we also address community level violence and racial violence in addressing ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, because we know that the study did not originally address that. And so, how can we as a community address those forms of trauma in the intersections? So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy the rest of Extra Give.